If you're trying to conceive and quietly wondering if life can be whole without a baby, feeling anxious, uncertain, or weary in your faith, you're not alone. Welcome to the Infertility and Trying to Conceive podcast for Christian women. I'm Linda Renee, an Aussie wife, mum, and follower of Jesus. Here I share biblical truth, simple conception tips, offer emotional support, and have honest conversations about what struggling to conceive really looks like as a Christian woman. My prayer is that this podcast lightens your load, keeps you anchored in Christ, and helps you move forward with confidence, peace, and hope. Christ goes before you, and I'm right here helping you look to Him every step of the way. Let's begin. Hey, and welcome back. Today we're talking about the intrusive, well-meaning, but sometimes totally oblivious questions that get asked at church when you're trying to conceive or when you're navigating infertility. And these questions pretty much never come at a good time. So we're going to look at three things. First, understanding why this is such a hard thing to deal with, and then some real practical things that you can say in response to those questions. And then the deeper stuff. What does the Bible say about this and how to navigate this as a Christian? Because I think often we feel like we're being rude or dishonest if we aren't open with people or we don't share how things really are for us in that moment. So you might have experienced being at church, after a hard week or a hard month, but you've made the effort to show up anyway. And you might be standing with someone that you're on a ministry team with or that you've seen around church, but not actually had a proper conversation with. Basically someone who knows you well enough to notice that you don't have kids, but maybe not well enough to know why. And they ask, so are you guys thinking about having kids? Or maybe it's the slightly more loaded question of when are you starting a family? And something inside you, just tightens because the answer is usually so much bigger and more complicated than the actual question. But you're surrounded by people and you've got to respond. And not only that, but you'll likely have to see this person again, probably next week. So how you handle this moment can feel like it actually really matters a lot. So why do people actually ask these questions? And why do these questions impact or trigger you differently? And I think it's because it's aimed at the exact thing that you want most and you don't have yet. And having a baby, wanting a baby, it's not just small talk. It's not filling the space about the weather or insignificant waffle. It lands right on the thing that's taking up all the space in your life right now. If you're tracking, hoping, the waiting, the grief and disappointment that's already there, it pokes and prods at all of that. And you've got about 2 seconds to respond in public without your face giving away the panic that you might feel. Because what do you actually say? The honest answer? It's probably too much, especially for someone that you don't know really well. And there's a reason for that beyond just privacy. You've probably learned, or you may learn, that sharing something this tender with the wrong person in the wrong moment doesn't just feel bad in that conversation, but it can follow you. You might see them next week, and then there's this awkward thing between you now. You don't know what to say, they don't know what to say, and they might avoid you. Or they ask every single week how it's going. And suddenly church, the place that you want to feel safe at, it can make you want to avoid it altogether. And I don't think that's dramatic. Sure, some people will think it is. And, they'll think that you just have to push your feelings aside and just be obedient to God and go to church and, not try and want to avoid these conversations. But I think things are not always as clear-cut as that, especially with people that are considered your spiritual family, who are called to hold one another and love and be gentle and tender-hearted and compassionate. And I'm the type of person who wears their heart on their sleeve, I'm pretty honest. So if you're anything like me, the polite nothing answer can also feel like it doesn't quite sit right. But on the other hand, the honest answer can also feel like it's too much. And when you're standing there trying to hold it together while also trying to manage your emotions and your heart, it can be a pretty awful experience. And then I think there's this church layer. And I say this because I absolutely think church can be the best place for hard things. But sometimes, not always, but sometimes, church culture adds this layer to this that makes it worse and not better. People sometimes say things like, God's timing is perfect, or just trust him, or maybe there's a reason for this. And they likely mean it in a really kind way. But when you're in the thick of infertility or loss or trying to conceive, comments like that can feel less like comfort and more like being told that there's a silver lining for your pain that you just haven't found yet. Which is most likely meant with love, but it's hard to take in when you're hurting. And on top of that, church tends to be very family orientated. You've got baby dedications and Mother's Day and kids' church and pregnant women everywhere in the congregation. And all of these things, they're good things. They're things that you likely want. But when you're aching for a family yourself, being surrounded by the things that you can't have or you don't have yet, no matter how strong your faith is, that can be tough. Your emotions are often close to the surface. The slightest thing can feel like it might just tip you over. I know when I was trying to conceive, I was running the creche at my church. And most weeks I could do it. But some weeks I'd walk in and I'd just want to avoid everyone. And the hard part wasn't, the work itself. It was the rostering, which probably sounds a little odd, but parents would bail at the last minute because their child was sick. And I'd have to jump in and fill the spot. And it wasn't the jumping in that got to me. It was that they had a reason, one that everyone understood without needing an explanation. Motherhood gave people a socially acceptable and spiritually acceptable reason to need grace. And I wanted that, not to get out of things or to avoid doing ministry, but just to have a reason that people understood without me having to say more. Because infertility is invisible. No one can see what you carry. And motherhood is a reason that trumps everything in that environment. And I wasn't a mum yet, so it kind of trumped me too. Or at least I felt that way. And I share that because I think there's these undercurrents in church life that you can't always see on the surface, but they can cause turmoil for you on the inside. And that's often the environment that you're navigating when someone asks you these unwanted or insensitive or inappropriate questions. You're carrying something heavy, and people can't always see that, but it's real and it's hard. So if we get into some practical things, and before I get into the nitty-gritty, I just want to say something that I think is more important than any of them. I don't think it's always struggling with knowing what to say. I think sometimes the harder thing can be believing that you're allowed to say it. Because underneath the awkwardness, you might actually feel like if I don't answer, I'm being rude. If they're offended, I've done something wrong. And good Christians should be open. If they care about me, I owe them an explanation. And yet not everyone is comfortable with being clear or upfront. Infertility is this experience where it can really impact your confidence, and it's not always easy to feel like you can stand up for yourself. Even the strongest Christians can second-guess things when everything feels unknown and uncertain. And I think it's even harder in Christian circles where we feel like we have to be kind and loving. And if you're generally a warm, friendly person or a people pleaser, this can be a really hard thing to implement. So let me just gently say, just because someone asks you questions about kids, it doesn't mean you have to answer how they expect you to. I know that sounds obvious, but it doesn't always feel like that in the moment, especially if you're someone who cares about people and doesn't want to seem cold or uncaring. But if you think about it this way, if someone asked you how much money you had in your bank account, most of us would feel completely fine in saying, oh, I don't really talk about that. Not because we're hiding something, and, not because we're being unkind, but just because not every piece of personal information has to be shared in every relationship. And your experience with trying to conceive is at least that private, and I think potentially even more so. And when you do draw that line, some people might feel a bit surprised or disappointed or awkward or even embarrassed. And it's possible to read their response as though you've done something wrong. But the truth is that their feelings belong to them. Your job is to respond kindly. It's not your job to make sure they never feel uncomfortable. And I think it's worth saying that sometimes people will be offended because they believe they're entitled to your personal details. That's different from being hurt. Someone might genuinely care about you and feel a little sad that you're not sharing, but a caring and emotionally safe person can also respect that this isn't something that you're ready or wanting to talk about right now, or even at all. Jesus loved people completely and perfectly, but he didn't tell everyone everything. He had circles. Some people had more access than others. He wasn't hiding, but he was wise. And I think infertility is one of those areas where wisdom for you might actually mean saying, I'm happy for you to pray for me, but I'm not ready to share the details. And that's not selfish. This is just taking care of something that's pretty tender right now. Okay, so with that said, here's some actual things that you can say. So this one's if you just want to shut it down warmly, and you don't need a reason beyond that. You don't have to be having a terrible day, you don't have to be falling apart, but sometimes you may be just not up for conversation. Or it might be also that you actually don't want people to know that you're trying for a baby or that it's a struggle. So saying something like, oh, we're just keeping that between us for now, or we'll let you know if we ever have news to share. This can imply that having kids may be something for the future, and it doesn't have to reveal that you're in the process of trying right now. Or you can redirect them gently away from the topic by saying, oh, life's pretty full at the moment. How are you going? I think your energy matters here more than your words. My husband often says to me, it's not always what you say, but it's how you say it. So if you say it warmly, most people will take the hint without feeling shut down. And that last one, flipping it back to them, works really well because most people are happy to talk about themselves. And the conversation just moves on before they've even really clocked what happened. So if you want to be honest without going into everything, sometimes you might not want to avoid the question completely, but you also might not want to open everything up in the middle of the church foyer. So this is for when you want to signal to someone that the topic's difficult for you, but without having to give a full update. And sometimes this needs a little bit of care because some answers can cause people to actually ask more questions. So where you can, think about what you're comfortable with people knowing and then stop there. So in this case, you might say something like, yeah, it's something we're walking through at the moment, but we're not really ready to talk about it yet. Or it's a hard thing to talk about at the moment, lots of emotions, but thanks for asking. Or you might even say, it's a bit more complicated than a yes or no with having kids, but we'd really appreciate prayer. These responses let people know that this is real, but it's also tender. I'm not brushing you off, but I'm also not opening a door. Most people will hear that and they'll likely soften and step back. And that last one is really good for at church specifically because it gives the person something they can actually do with their care. Instead of asking more questions, they can pray. And if someone keeps pushing after you've said something like that, and occasionally someone will, you can just repeat yourself. Same words, same tone. Yeah, like I said, we're just keeping that one pretty private. You don't have to justify it. Hopefully saying it twice is the message for them. And if you're at a place where you actually want to share and be open with people about where things are at because you're done carrying it invisibly and you want someone to actually know, that's completely valid. Sharing it with the right person can actually be a real relief, and it can open up exactly the kind of community that you need. And people might actually surprise you by giving you grace to be able to pull away from things when you're not up to it. So if you're directly asked about having a baby, saying something like, yeah, we'd love to have kids. We're actually in the middle of trying. It's been a bit of a hard road, so we'd really value your prayers. Or, honestly, it's something we're walking through and it hasn't been easy, but we'd love people to be praying for us. Or, we're hoping for kids, it's just taking us longer than we expected. It's been hard, but we're trusting God with it. That invites real community without requiring you to, give a medical update in the middle of being surrounded by a whole bunch of people at church. It's honest and it's real and it tells them how to respond with prayer, not more questions. And if they're a safe person, the conversation may naturally flow from there. And so how does being a Christian actually make a difference here? Because this really is a hard space to be in. But one thing I always hold to, and I know that I've talked about Hagar before, and I keep coming back to her in the moment where she gives God the name El Roi, the God who sees me. Because God sees you even if no one else does. And I think about that a lot with infertility, because so much of what you carry in this season is just invisible. Often no one sees it. The grief can be invisible, the effort can be invisible. The fact that you showed up after a super hard week and still smile at people while carrying all of this, often people don't see that either. And our culture doesn't really know how to handle invisible pain well. And your church family might not either, even if they love you. But God does. He's literally the God who sees what nobody else can see. He sees the things that you're carrying that you can't even find words for. He sees what it costs you to walk through that church door. And I know that doesn't fix it. He sees it and it's still happening. And that gap between him seeing it and him actually changing it, that can be such a hard place to be. But if I can say this as gently as possible, you're not defined by this chapter of your life. Christian culture, and I say this as someone who loves my church family, can sometimes send the message that the most valuable or important thing a woman can do is become a mum. Which means that if you're not a mum yet, you're sort of just waiting to arrive, like motherhood is the destination and everything else is just the lead up. But when we look at the New Testament, there's many women in there that aren't mainly defined by whether or not they had kids. You know, the woman who anointed Jesus' feet, the women at the tomb, the first ones Jesus told, the ones he chose to be the first witnesses. There's Lydia and Priscilla. The Bible doesn't say whether or not they had children, but they are mentioned in Scripture not for their roles as mothers, but as women who clung to Christ, who trusted him, and who had him at their centre. So your identity is not on hold. It isn't waiting to be finalised when you get that positive test. You are not just a woman who doesn't have kids yet. You are a daughter of God who is walking through something really hard right now. And a season like this doesn't have to define who you are. Another thing I think that helps in coping with unwanted questions and comments is that God has actually told us what he does in the hard times. Romans 5 says suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance produces character, and character, hope. And I talked about hope last week and how that can ground us in this tough time. James also says the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And Peter talks about faith being like gold refined through fire. And these aren't just nice things to say. They're actual claims. God is saying, here's what I do when things are hard. Here's what I'm doing in you right now. And I actually don't think you can always feel it happening. But a helpful question to consider is, do you actually trust what God says that he does, even when you can't see much evidence of that? Because doing so, trusting him, I think is a pretty big act of faith. Deciding to believe what God says is true, even when your life doesn't feel like it's showing any of that. And I'd say the majority of us know that God can open wombs. He's done it for many, many women, and he's done it throughout the Bible. He can heal, he can step in, but sometimes he doesn't, or at least not yet. And I think the hardest part is when you're living right in that gap between what you know he can do and what he's actually doing right now. And that gap can feel like silence. It can feel like your prayers aren't getting answered. It can feel like something's gone wrong. But it hasn't gone wrong. That gap is often where your faith and trust grows. When things feel like they're falling apart, Christ says he gives you strength to keep holding on to him. And I think that's one thing that can help you cope with those questions, those unwanted questions that you may get week after week. It's not just having a good line ready. It's knowing that the season that you're in, as hard as it is not outside God's hands. And that changes how you navigate it. So in wrapping up, we've talked about why questions about kids can hit so hard, what you can actually say when they come, and why it's okay not to share everything, and what can actually help you cope when so much around you feels unstable. So I hope you walk away today with at least one thing that's useful, whether that's a line you can use next time someone asks, or just the reminder that you are seen by the God who sees what nobody else can, in the middle of something that often feels invisible to everybody else but you. And that's worth holding on to. Thanks for being here today. I'll see you next time. Bye. Before you go, thank you so much for listening. I pray today's episode has brought you fresh hope for whatever comes next. If someone comes to mind today who could truly use support in this space, please share this episode or the podcast with them. It might be exactly what they need. And if you could take 30 seconds to give me a star rating or leave 1 or 2 sentences about what this podcast has meant to you on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd be ever so grateful. Your feedback not only helps others find the podcast, but it truly makes my day. And words of affirmation are my love language. And if you're not sure how to do that, I'll pop the links in the show notes below. Lastly, although I do have a nursing degree, everything shared in this podcast is for inspiration and education only. Please don't use it as a replacement for advice from your personal, medical, or mental health professional. There's absolutely no shame in getting additional support when you need it, but always consult your expert team before making any changes to your fertility journey. That's all from me today. Take care, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.